Hello and welcome to this webinar on the identification of broad-leaved pondweeds. I'm Nick Stewart. I've been a freelance botanist for over 30 years and have a particular interest in aquatic plants and aquatic vegetation. Over that period, I've seen a lot of changes in aquatic flora. And one of the problems has always been is that there are rather less people looking at aquatic plants. People find them a bit more scary. There are families that are not familiar with people that are looking at terrestrial vegetation. So I'm hoping that this webinar will inspire you to take a greater interest and find that they're not as difficult as you might think. It is one of the sweetest seminars that I've been doing on aquatic plant identification for the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland. And today we're going to look at one of the larger families, the pondweeds, and specifically part of that family, the broad-leaved pondweeds. I will be doing another webinar in a few weeks' time on the narrow-leaved pondweeds, which I hope you can all attend if you're still interested. So pondweeds belong in their own family, in monocots. There are, including some satellite species, satellite genera, there are 22 species in Britain and Ireland. 19 of these are in Potamogeton. 2 are in a new genera called Stachenia, but for a lot of people, we're still using Potamogeton filiformis and Potamogeton pectinatus, but I think the geneticists have decided that it should be a separate genus. And there is also one species of Groenlandia, which I'll also be talking about today. This pie chart is quite interesting. It shows the number of records for pondweeds in the BSBI mapping database, and shows the proportion of the different species. And over half of the records are just 2 species, Potamogeton natans and Potamogeton polygonifolius. Which they are common species, and that's part of the reason for the number of records. But they're also, because they've got obvious floating leaves, they're much more obvious and easier to identify than some of the other species. And so the red area in this diagram covers the remaining 20 species, and it shows that there are far fewer records of these because people are less clear about them. Identification handbooks. The best one is the available is the BSBI handbook by Chris Preston. This cover's a bit faded, I'm afraid, but it is very comprehensive and has a lot of detail which will help with the identification. There are keys and a lot of discussion about what things you might confuse them with. Also useful is plant crib. Some of you may be familiar with this, but those that aren't, the plant crib is a book which doesn't cover all species, but it goes into more detail about selected group of species, and in fact it does quite well for aquatic plants. There's a section on water starwets, a section on water crowfoot's, but there are also some useful tips for some of the pondweeds, some of the more similar pondweeds. Another useful book is Richard Lansdowne's book on river plants. Although specifically aimed at rivers, there's a lot of overlap with standing waters, so will be equally useful if you're looking at lakes. And again, it goes into detail with tables and things for species that are quite similar, and you can get more detail than you would get from the floras. But on the whole, pondweeds are not well covered by the Collins and other color guides, and they're better than they used to, but because in the past pondweeds were hardly covered at all. But I would recommend those books particularly. Also, hopefully you will find useful on the Aquatic Plants website, project website. I have produced over the years a number of keys which will help, I hope, identify. This is the one for the broad-leaved pondweeds, the one that's relevant for today. But there are others on various. There's an introduction to aquatic plants. There's another one on water starwets. There's another on water crowfoots, and also ones for different leaf forms. So hopefully those will be useful and accessible. They're designed to be on A4 paper that you can laminate and take out in the field, rather than taking out books and getting them wet and dropping them in the water. So pondweeds come in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have two features in common. So there are some that have floating leaves that float on the surface, some with expanded underwater leaves. There are ones that look very stringy, and one or two that are quite strappy in shape. But they all have staggered leaves, with the exception of Groenlandia, which I'll come to later. But they have staggered leaves, and they also have stipules. Now, stipules are some tubes of tissue which surround the stem when the plants are growing. You can see here, these are the stipules. They do pull away from the stem as the plant gets older. But if you have this combination of alternate leaves and stipules, then you can go straight to Potamogeton. There aren't any other things that have that combination. And the pondweeds divide into two groups, the narrow-leaved pondweeds and the broad-leaved pondweeds. And today we're going to be talking about the broad-leaved pondweeds, but just quickly to discuss the differences. The narrow-leaved pondweeds all have leaves that are less than a centimetre wide. Broad-leaved ones have leaves which are generally more than a centimetre wide. However, there are a few species where it's a bit sort of ambiguous. They're about 1 centimetre wide. So the other factor that puts it in one of these is that the leaves of the narrow-leaved ones are parallel-sided and sort of strap-shaped or linear, whereas in the broad-leaved pondweeds, the leaves taper widest in the middle and taper at both ends. So just to discuss some of the species that around the 1 centimetre mark, there is the curled pondweed, which is a very distinctive one because it has very prominent teeth along the edges of the leaf. It's the only species that has that. But the leaves are essentially parallel-sided, so it's one that I will cover in more detail in the narrow-leaved when we discuss that in a later webinar. Another feature of the curled pondweed is that it has a compressed stem, and that is a feature of the narrow-leaved pondweeds. They all have either a sort of oval or even flatter cross-section to the stem, whereas the stems of the broad-leaved pondweeds are cylindrical. This is another one with leaves about a centimetre wide. It's a rare species, only in a few lakes in the Outer Hebrides, and as an introduction in a canal in Lancashire. And it has long, narrow leaves. So again, they're more or less parallel sided. So again, I will cover this in when we discuss the narrow leaf pondweeds, but it does produce floating leaves when it gets to the surface, which are a bit like the bog pondweed. So today we're talking about the broad-leaved pondweeds. So the leaves are at least usually at least 1 centimeter wide. They can be narrower, but if they're narrow, then they're widest near the middle and taper at both ends. And in the broad-leaved pondweeds, there are two types of leaf. There are the ones that float on the water surface, that are completely opaque and have a strong cuticle, and underwater leaves, which are translucent, almost look like looking through stained glass when you're looking through them. So that they're quite distinct, different types of leaf. And I'll start off with the ones that only produce floating leaves, or they look as though they only produce floating leaves. I'll go into detail, a bit more detail as to what they do underwater in a little while. But essentially, there are two species that commonly occur without any underwater leaves, just the opaque floating leaves. There is a third one, coloratus, which sometimes have semi-opaque leaves, but essentially, if you've got only opaque leaves, you're dealing with Potamogeton natans, the broad-leaved pondweed, and Potamogeton polygonifolius, the bog pondweed. And they're quite easy to separate. The first thing you look for, which is a feature of Potamogeton natans, is just immediately below the leaf. You can see here, and you can see here, there's about ½ centimeter of slightly discolored, different colored bit of stem. It's a flexible bit of stem which allows the plant, when it gets to the water surface, to position the leaf wherever it fits better on the water surface, so that they're not overlapping. But so it does mean that there tends to be very often a slight angle where the leaf gets to the water surface, which you can often see from a distance. Potamogeton natans produces this. The bog pondweed, Potamogeton polygonifolius, doesn't produce that, nor any of the other species that produce floating leaves. Just for contrast, there's the bog pondweed, Potamogeton polygonifolius, and you see that the stalk runs smoothly from the stem into the leaf, and there's no discolored bit of stem. Another useful character for separating the two is the stipule. The stipules of Potamogeton natans are large, often very large, can be as long as 10 centimeters in some cases, but they're quite stiff and they're acute, whereas those of polygonifolius are smaller. That there is overlap there, but they're much smaller, they're floppier, and they're blunt-ended. And you can even do them if you only have a single leaf washed up on the edge of the lake. You can do them just by looking at the venation of the leaf. In Potamogeton natans, you get the longitudinal veins running sort of parallel all the way up the leaf, tend to be just paler than the surrounding leaf, and that it looks almost like translucent hairs. And the cross veins, if you get a hand lens, you can actually see the cross veins, but they're very obscure. Whereas if you look at Potamogeton polygonifolius, the veins, for a start, they tend to be darker. They tend to be darker than the leaf, or same color as the rest of the leaf. But the cross veins are much more obvious. So even if you just have one leaf washed up, you can separate the two. If you have fruits, then there's also quite a size difference in the fruits, but normally you don't need that because the other characters that we've discussed are usually quite easy to separate them. So just to recap, you have Potamogeton natans, the broadleaf pondweed, which has this flexible joint at the top of the petiole. The veins of the floating leaves are paler than the rest of the leaf, and the cross veins are obscure. They have long, acute stipules and large fruits. Whereas Potamogeton polygonifolius doesn't have the flexible joint at the top of the petiole. The veins are darker than the leaf, and the cross veins are much more visible, and it has smaller fruits and shorter stipules. Now, Potamogeton natans does actually produce underwater leaves, but they just don't look like underwater leaves. What they do is they produce what are called phyllodes, which are basically look like very long stalks for floating leaves, for leaf stalks. They're quite solid in texture, and so it's illustrated quite nicely here. And they don't look like normal underwater leaves, but they have the same function. And normally it's not a great problem, but you will find young plants where the plant hasn't reached the water surface, where you just have the phyllodes, and those can be very confusing. So you just need to be aware that if you find, I mean, you know it's a pondweed because it's got alternate leaves and it's got very prominent stipules, but you might think that this was a narrow-leaved pondweed rather than the underwater leaves of the common pondweed. Potamogeton polygonifolius also sometimes produces underwater leaves, particularly before it gets to the surface. So in young plants, you may find the underwater leaves of the bog pondweed. The underwater leaves of Potamogeton polygonifolius are translucent leaves. So I will discuss those in greater detail when I go on to talking about the underwater leaves. But the essential point that distinguishes it is that the leaves, even the underwater leaves, have quite long stalks. Now, the third one I mentioned was in this context of ones that could just have floating leaves. Is the fen pondweed, Potamogeton coloratus. Normally it produces underwater, these translucent underwater leaves, but just occasionally when it gets to the surface, it produces a leaf that is more opaque, and often not completely opaque. They're often just sort of, you can see there's a certain amount of translucence to the leaf here. And very rarely you will get just these leaves, so they need to be mentioned here, but I will go into more detail when we're talking about the underwater leaves. But just the characters that you need to look for the fen pondweed, the leaves are stalked, but the stalks are much shorter than the leaf blade. And the leaves tend to be broadest a little below the middle, and the petiole is often thicker at the top. So just underneath the leaf, the leaf stalk tends to get wider and get narrower as it gets towards the stem. I'll come back to these characters later, but also they have smaller fruits. Coloratus has smaller fruits than polygonifolius. Another thing between coloratus and polygonifolius they both have these obvious cross veins. Coloratus, it's quite a subtle difference. It tends to be more horizontal by the cross veins by the time you get to the edge of the leaf, whereas in polygonifolius they tend to be still a little bit ascending. But there's quite a subtle difference, but it can help a bit, because there are some occasions when the separation between the two, I mean, ecologically they're very different. One's coloratus is a hard water species, and polygonifolius is a soft water species, but there are occasions when you have hard water mixing with acid peat where you might have difficulty. Another feature of coloratus is very common for the leaf to actually be a little bit decurrent on to the top of the petiole. So you've got a little bit of a flange coming down the leaf stalk, which you don't get in polygonifolius. Now, there are several other species that can sometimes produce floating leaves. Often they're rather shy in doing so, but there are three species: Potamogeton alpinus, Potamogeton gramineus, and Potamogeton nodosus, which can produce floating leaves, but they are always with the underwater leaves, and the underwater leaves are much easier to do the identification. So if you have a choice, if you've got translucent leaves as well as floating leaves, go to the underwater leaves because they're much more useful for and easier to identify. But you do need to be aware that if you have, particularly in places like reservoirs, you have the species with underwater leaves being beached. You can see here that there's still, you can see the dried up underwater leaves, and if they're in this situation for longer, these will start breaking up, and you could just be left with the green tufts of opaque leaves. So, and in that case, you would have considerable difficulty, say, telling between Potamogeton gramineus and polygonifolius, because these floating leaves are pretty similar to each other. So if we move on to the broad-leaved pondweeds, which produce at least some translucent underwater leaves, you can get a long way with these just on two characters. You look at the leaf tip as to whether they're acute or obtuse, and you look at the leaf base as to whether they're rounded, whether they're tapered, or whether they have a stalk. And if you look at those two characters, you very quickly narrow down to one or two possibilities in each case. So they're not difficult to do. And so here what you're looking for, the leaf tips, in the acute tipped ones, they're often quite sharply acute, but there's very often, or sometimes a cusp or things, but they're very sort of sharply pointed. Whereas the other group are ones with rounded tips, and this one, which is actually Potamogeton alpinus, although the general shape of the leaf looks as though it's quite sharply pointed, when you actually look at the tip, it's quite eventually quite blunt. So this counts as one of the ones with blunt or rounded tips. And the leaf bases, what you're looking at is whether they're rounded at the base, or whether they're tapered at the base, or whether there's a stalk. And the stalks don't need to be very long. Sometimes they're just a sort of half centimetre or so, but you can see there's a distinct stalk here. And that takes you, as I say, into two, or in this case, three possibilities. But it narrows things down very quickly. And I'm going to work through these boxes. I'll start with the acute tipped ones, and then move on to the rounded tipped ones. I will leave Groenlandia. Groenlandia at first glance looks as though it has acute tips, but actually when you look closely, they're usually quite blunt tipped at the final tip. So I'll discuss Groenlandia in more detail when we get to this box here. So I'll jump straight to this one with the leaf tips acute and with tapered leaf bases. And here we just have the one option, Potamogeton gramineus, the various leaf pondweed. It's the only one with that combination. And there are a number of other characters that are quite typical of it. This curliness is very typical. It has really quite short stipules, often about just a centimetre long, sometimes a little longer. And they often roll up into a point and sort of pull away from the stem, and that can produce quite a distinctive sort of pointy stipule sticking out from the nodes. Moving on to the next box, the leaves that have the acute tip but have a stalk, and there are two possibilities here, that one of which is a rare species in southern England. So essentially, again, we're dealing with one species, Potamogeton lucens, the shining pondweed, and it's called shining pondweed because it has these very large glossy leaves which are very distinctive. And another feature of Potamogeton lucens, in contrast to the gramineus we were talking about a moment ago, it has very long stipules, often sort of 4 or 5 or 6 centimeters long, and they have a little flange running down the sort of the two strong veins, which are actually form a keel with a little sort of flange on each side, and it's one of the few species that are quite so strongly keeled. But the stalks, it has leaves that are stalked, often not very strongly. They're just sort of up to a centimetre at maximum, and often sort of quite considerably less. The other one in this group, so with acute tipped leaves and stalks, is this rare species that occurs in a few rivers in southern England, Potamogeton nodosus, Loddon pondweed, named after one of the rivers that it grows in. It differs from lucens in having much longer stalks to the leaves, and the stipules are quite long. You can see them here, but they're not keeled in the same way that they are in Potamogeton lucens. It's not a great picture, but it's just the best that I have available. So if we move on to the right-hand side of that table that I was looking at, so we've got the species that have rounded bases to the leaves and rounded tips. And essentially, there are two species to consider here. There's Groenlandia, which I'll come to in a moment as well. But the two species are Potamogeton perfoliatus, perfoliate pondweed, and Potamogeton praelongus, the long-stalked pondweed. The key thing for separating those two is the stipules. Stipules are quite a useful character in the broad-leaved pondweeds. I've mentioned them several times already, and they're a very useful character for separating or additional characters. So in Potamogeton perfoliatus, the stipules are very small and they decay very early. So to actually find the stipules on perfoliatus, you would actually have to get right at the tip with the very youngest leaves and look in amongst them, and they're just about a few millimeters long and rather pale and weak, and they disappear very quickly. So this is one pondweed where often you will find that there are no stipules visible. But it's fortunately a fairly distinctive thing, so you're not going to confuse it with much else. Just sort of going back to the fact that the staggered leaves and have presence of stipules makes it a pondweed. But this is a fairly distinctive one. But the key thing with perfoliatus is that the leaves, the stipules, disappear very quickly. The leaves tend to be rounder than they are in praelongus. Praelongus tends to have longer leaves, but you can see here the stipules are much more prominent, and they will persist even to when the plant's rotting away. You'll still have fibrous remnants of the stipules visible. Another typical feature of praelongus is that it often has a very hooded tip to the leaf. Perfoliatus will produce a bit of a hooded tip, but it tends to be a bit more prominent in the long-stalked pondweed, and often in herbarium specimens you can actually see because once you press, there's the hood splits open. You often have a little nick in the end where the hood has burst. I should perhaps mention that the long stalked is nothing to do with the leaves, it's to do with the flowers. It has quite a long stalked flower, but the leaves are completely stalkless. So don't confuse that with this is a species without a stalk. But again, like perfoliatus, it has a rounded bases and the rounded tips. And here's another view of the stipules. Just to show them, they're often quite sort of milky in texture too. Now, in fact, when I gave this talk previously, I had this only as being an acute-leaved species, but I have since had a bit more opportunity to look at the opposite-leaved pondweed. And usually, although superficially the leaf looks as though it's quite acute tipped, when you look closely at the tips, you'll usually find that it's actually quite a rounded tip. So I have, for the purposes of that table, I've put this Groenlandia in both categories, but essentially it has a sort of rounded base to the leaf. And this sort of acute to obtuse tip, it's a bit ambiguous, and you might find both present. But superficially, it's quite a pointed leaf. Key thing about Groenlandia densa is, unlike Potamogetons, the leaves are opposite, and often sort of enclose the stem. So they're in opposite pairs all the way up. It does produce a few stipules, but only in particular places like where there's a branch, you will find a stipule, but they're not very obvious stipules like the pondweeds are too. But it's the only species that has these opposite leaves that we're dealing with. It's unfortunately, it's a rare species. And getting even rarer. It's protected in the Republic of Ireland, but even in Britain, it's red listed and seems to be on the decline. It's particularly associated with calcareous waters, and it's one species that seems to be badly affected by pollution. Moving on to the next box, we're now dealing with the leaf tip rounded, but leaves with taper bases. And here the only option is Potamogeton alpinus, the red pondweed. And you can see the leaves are, they're sort of quite narrowly tapered at the tip, but ultimately we got quite a rounded tip to the leaf. And that combination of rounded tips, tapered bases, takes you straight to alpinus. Another useful character that sort of can confirm the alpinus it has very strong air channels on either side of the midrib, particularly when you look at the base of the base of the leaf. Now, a lot of pondweeds will produce these sort of larger cells on either side of the midrib. So in fact, when you're looking here, what you're looking at, the midrib is only this dark bit in the middle, and you can see particularly here these larger cells, and these the technical word is lacunae, but they're large cells which give the leaf extra and the plant extra buoyancy. And in alpinus, they're very prominent and often occupy sort of a third of the leaf base by the time you get to the base of the leaf. But you will find them in other species, but it's just in alpinus they're very prominent. And the final box in that table we're referring to is leaves with obtuse or rounded leaves and have stalks. And here we come back to the two bog pondweed, the Potamogeton polygonifolius and the fen pondweed, Potamogeton coloratus. And in the bog pondweed, the leaves are always quite narrowly lanceolate, and they have long stalks, often longer than the leaf lamina itself. Whereas in coloratus, the leaf stalks are much shorter, and the leaves are much wider. Sometimes can be quite ovate in shape. They tend to be narrower in the winter, so and sometimes the leaf stalks are a little bit longer in the winter. So, but during the summer they're usually quite distinct on the shape of the leaf and the length of the leaf stalk. So just on those two characters, the leaf tip and the leaf base, it makes them the broad-leaved pondweeds really quite easy to do. But there is one fly in the ointment, and that is that they do hybridize. And pondweed hybrids are actually they're not fly-by-night things. They are quite very long, persistent things, and they act as pseudo-species. So there are a number of examples where you get a pondweed hybrid with either one or sometimes none of the parents. And indeed, there is one hybrid in the River Liffey and the River Tweed, which involves a Scandinavian species, which hasn't been in Britain and Ireland for certainly centuries, maybe millennia. And there are other examples. For example, Potamogeton lucens is quite a southern species in Britain and Ireland, and when you get to Scotland, it becomes quite a rare species. But the hybrid involving lucens and gramineus occurs more widely in Scotland, and maybe a sort of relic back from the Atlantic period when things were warmer, the climate was warmer, and maybe lucens at that time extended further north. However, most combinations of hybrids are rare or extremely rare, but there are three hybrids that you will come across occasionally, and I just wanted to quickly mention these. But I'd say don't worry about those to start. Get the hang of the species, and then because that's quite easy to do. And as you become more familiar with those, you'll recognize that there are hybrids present. But just quickly was going to go through what you would look out for to recognize these hybrids. So the three hybrids are the three combinations: so gramineus lucens, gramineus perfoliatus, and lucens perfoliatus, and all the other sort of hybrids are really quite rare things. So of those three, probably the most frequent is gramineus and perfoliatus, which is called nitens. And what you're looking for in that tends to be something rather gramineus-like. So you've got the pointed tips, the leaves, and often the rather curliness and these rather short pointy stipules. But the difference is that the leaf base is quite rounded. You can see it particularly there. Normal gramineus would just be tapered gradually into the stalk, into the stem, whereas if you see a gramineus with a rounded base, then it's quite likely to be this hybrid. You do get ones which are a bit more perfoliatus like, and if so, the character that would easily separate it is that the stipules are persistent. So if you see a perfoliatus that has persistent stipules, then it may be this hybrid. The hybrid between gramineus and lucens, which is called angustifolius now, it used to be called zizii. Again, in this case, there tends to be more intermediate between the two parents. It tends to be quite large and glossy leaved like lucens, but the stipules, whereas stipules or lucens are long and often keeled, stipules in the hybrid tend to be smaller, but not as small usually as those of gramineus. And they don't have any keel to them. And the other thing is that lucens has a short stalk to the leaf, whereas the hybrid doesn't. So none of the leaves would be stalked. And the third hybrid is Potamogeton salicifolius, which is the lucens perfoliatus hybrid. Again, it has the larger glossy leaves of the lucens, but has a much more rounded base to the leaf. It still has the lucens point to the tip of the leaf. It's still got that little sharp cusp at the tip, but it has a more rounded base. And again, shouldn't have any stalk to the leaf. So hopefully, apart from that little fly in the ointment about hybrids, the broad-leaved pondweeds are really quite easy to separate. And hopefully that makes things a little clearer. And it just remains me to thank particularly the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland for organising this, and to the National Parks and Wildlife that has been funding these webinars.